Hello everyone, welcome back to another story. Before we get started, comment below where you're from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. June 18th, 1997. Atlanta, Georgia. The heat hung thick in the air, the kind of suffocating summer evening where even the cicadas seemed too tired to sing. Emma Thompson sat on the edge of her bed in the small apartment on Piedmont Avenue, her hands trembling as she held the cordless phone. 27 years old, with auburn hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and green eyes that once sparkled with life, but now carried the weight of years of fear. The bruise on her left cheekbone had faded to a sickly yellow-green, makeup barely concealing what had happened 3 nights before. Her ribs ached when she breathed too deeply, a reminder of the price she paid for speaking her mind, for daring to suggest that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioner struggling against the Georgia heat. Emma had waited for this moment, planned it carefully during the brief windows when Marcus was at work, when she could think clearly without his presence suffocating every thought. Marcus Reeves. The man she had met 5 years earlier at a coffee shop downtown. The man who had seemed so charming, so attentive, so perfect. He had swept her off her feet with grand gestures and passionate declarations, making her feel like the center of his universe. She had ignored the early warning signs, the way he needed to know where she was at all times, the subtle criticisms disguised as concern, the gradual isolation from friends and family. By the time she realized what was happening, she was already trapped in a web of control and fear that tightened around her with each passing month. Emma pressed the numbers on the phone keypad, her sister's number committed to memory like a lifeline. Sarah, 3 years younger, living in Savannah with her husband and their 2-year-old daughter. Sarah, who had questioned Emma's relationship from the beginning, who had seen through Marcus's charm to the darkness underneath. Sarah, who had begged Emma to leave, who had offered her a place to stay, who had cried when Emma insisted everything was fine, even as the light dimmed in her eyes. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Emma's heart hammered against her broken ribs. The answering machine clicked on, Sarah's cheerful voice asking callers to leave a message after the beep. Emma took a shaky breath, tears already forming in her eyes. The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other as if she might run out of time. She told Sarah that she loved her, that she was sorry for pushing her away, for all the times she had lied and made excuses and canceled plans at the last minute. She told her about the fear that had become her constant companion, about the way Marcus monitored her every movement, about the violence that erupted without warning over the smallest perceived slight. She told her about the plan she had been forming, the money she had been hiding in small amounts, the bus ticket she had purchased to Charleston, where she hoped to disappear and start over. She told her that tonight was the night, that Marcus would be working late at the construction site, that this was her chance. And then Emma's voice broke as she spoke the words that would haunt Sarah for years to come. "If you're hearing this, I couldn't fight anymore." The line went dead. The message was left at 6:47 in the evening, timestamp preserved forever in digital memory, a ghost of a moment when hope and desperation collided. Emma stood up from the bed, wincing at the pain in her side. She had packed a small duffel bag, hidden under the bathroom sink behind the cleaning supplies where Marcus never looked. Just the essentials. A few changes of clothes, toiletries, the $273 she had managed to save by skimming small amounts from grocery money over the past 4 months. Her mother's silver locket, the only piece of jewelry that mattered. A photograph of Sarah and their parents taken before their father passed away from a heart attack when Emma was 19. She grabbed the bag, checked the apartment one last time, and moved toward the door. But something stopped her. A sound. The rumble of Marcus's truck in the parking lot below, 2 hours earlier than expected. Emma's blood turned to ice. Her hands went numb. The keys she had been holding clattered to the floor. Through the thin walls, she could hear his heavy footsteps on the stairs, the jangle of his keys, his voice cursing about something that had gone wrong at the work site. She looked at the door, then at the bag in her hands, then back at the door. There was no time, no escape. The lock turned. Marcus walked in, his 6'2" frame filling the doorway, work boots leaving dirt on the carpet Emma had vacuumed that morning. His face was red, whether from the heat or anger Emma couldn't tell. His eyes, that particular shade of gray that could shift from warm to glacial in an instant, locked onto the bag in her hands. The temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the summer heat. Time stretched and compressed simultaneously, seconds feeling like hours as understanding dawned in his expression. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Then he smiled. But it wasn't the smile she had fallen in love with years ago. It was something else entirely, something predatory and cold. The neighbors in the apartment below would later tell police they heard raised voices that evening. Nothing unusual for the Thompson-Reeves residence, where arguments were frequent enough that most people had learned to turn up their televisions and mind their own business. One neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived across the hall, thought she heard something heavy being dragged across the floor around 9:30, followed by the sound of Marcus's truck starting up around 10:15. She didn't think much of it at the time. People moved furniture. People came and went. It wasn't her place to interfere. By midnight, the apartment was dark and silent. Emma Thompson was gone. Her duffel bag remained under the bathroom sink. Her mother's locket sat on the dresser. The bus ticket to Charleston, scheduled for departure at 11:30 that night, went unused. The seat stayed empty as the Greyhound pulled out of the station and headed north along I-95. Sarah listened to the voicemail the next morning while feeding her daughter breakfast. She played it once, then immediately again, the blood draining from her face as Emma's words sank in. "If you're hearing this, I couldn't fight anymore." She tried calling back. The phone rang and rang. No answer. She called again an hour later. Still nothing. By noon, panic had fully set in. Sarah called the Atlanta Police Department from Savannah, her voice shaking as she tried to explain that her sister was in danger, that something terrible had happened. The officer who took her call was polite, but non-committal. "Adults have the right to go where they please, ma'am. Maybe she just needed some space." "Has it been 24 hours? No? Well, we generally wait at least that long before filing a missing persons report." Sarah drove to Atlanta that afternoon, making the 3.5-hour journey in just under 3 hours, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She went directly to Emma's apartment on Piedmont Avenue. She knocked, pounded, called Emma's name until her voice was hoarse. Mrs. Patterson from across the hall finally opened her door, informed Sarah that she hadn't seen Emma since the day before, that Marcus had left around 10:15 the previous night in his truck and hadn't returned. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she could barely get her spare key into the lock. Emma had given it to her 2 years earlier during a brief moment of clarity when Marcus was out of town, making Sarah promise to keep it hidden, to only use it in an emergency. The apartment was eerily neat. Too neat. Emma had always been tidy, but this was different. This was the kind of clean that suggested someone had scrubbed away evidence, had carefully arranged things to present a particular narrative. Sarah walked through the rooms, her heart in her throat, looking for signs of struggle, for blood, for anything that might tell her what had happened. The bedroom looked normal. The bathroom was spotless. The kitchen showed no signs of dinner having been prepared. In the living room, Sarah noticed something odd. The area rug in front of the couch was slightly askew, bunched up at one corner as if it had been moved and hastily replaced. Underneath, the hardwood floor showed drag marks, faint but visible if you knew to look. Sarah called the police again, this time from Emma's apartment. She was more insistent, more frantic. Her sister had left a disturbing voicemail. She hadn't been seen since the previous evening. Her boyfriend had a history of abuse, and there were signs something violent had occurred. A patrol officer arrived 40 minutes later, took her statement, walked through the apartment with a flashlight even though it was the middle of the afternoon. He took notes, asked about Marcus's full name and last known whereabouts, asked if Emma had any reason to just leave on her own. Sarah played him the voicemail. The officer's expression softened slightly as he listened to Emma's voice, the desperation and fear impossible to miss. He promised to file a report, said they would try to locate Marcus Reeves for questioning, told Sarah they would do everything they could. But everything they could proved insufficient. Marcus Reeves had vanished as completely as Emma. His truck was found 3 days later in the long-term parking lot at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, unlocked with the keys in the ignition. Airport security footage showed a man matching Marcus's description entering the terminal around midnight on June 18th. But the cameras lost him in the crowds, and no airline had a record of him boarding a flight under his real name. His employer at the construction company said he hadn't shown up for work since that day, hadn't called in, had simply disappeared. His apartment lease was paid through the end of the month, but his belongings remained untouched, gathering dust. The investigation stalled almost immediately. Without a body, without clear evidence of foul play beyond Sarah's suspicions and the ominous voicemail, the case lacked the urgency that might have mobilized more resources. Detectives interviewed neighbors, co-workers, and the handful of friends Emma had managed to maintain, despite Marcus's attempts to isolate her. Everyone painted a picture of a troubled relationship, of a woman who had grown increasingly withdrawn and anxious, of a man with a temper and controlling tendencies. But suspicions weren't evidence. The lead detective, a veteran named David Morrison, who was 6 months from retirement, did what he could with limited resources and mounting caseloads. He filed the reports, followed the few leads that existed, and eventually watched as Emma's case joined the growing stack of unsolved disappearances that haunted his filing cabinets. Sarah refused to accept the silence. She plastered missing person flyers throughout Atlanta, Emma's smiling face from better days staring out from telephone poles and community bulletin boards. She contacted local news stations, managed to get a brief segment on the evening news. She hired a private investigator, spent thousands of dollars she and her husband couldn't afford, chasing leads that went nowhere. The PI discovered that Marcus had been using multiple credit cards under different names, had a history of domestic violence complaints from previous relationships that had been dropped when the women involved moved away or stopped cooperating. But none of it brought Emma home. Months turned into years. Sarah's daughter grew from a toddler to a kindergartner to a middle schooler. And still, there was no news of Emma. The voicemail remained saved on Sarah's answering machine, then transferred to a cassette tape, then digitized and stored on her computer, a precious artifact of her sister's last known moments. She played it sometimes late at night when she couldn't sleep, torturing herself with the what-ifs and if-onlys that consumed her thoughts. What if she had been home to answer the phone? What if she had driven to Atlanta that same evening? What if she had been more insistent years earlier, had physically dragged Emma away from Marcus when she first saw the signs of abuse? The Atlanta Police Department officially reclassified Emma's case as a cold case in 2001, 4 years after her disappearance. the file was moved to a different department, handled by a different set of detectives who specialized in cases that had gone cold, who sifted through old evidence with fresh eyes when time permitted. But time rarely permitted. New cases demanded attention. Resources were finite. Emma Thompson became one name among hundreds of others, a file in a cabinet, a case number in a database, a photograph on a missing persons website that fewer and fewer people visited as the years passed. Detective Jennifer Chen joined the Atlanta PD Cold Case Unit in 2002, a transfer from robbery homicide where she had distinguished herself with meticulous attention to detail and an almost obsessive dedication to solving cases that others had given up on. She was 34 years old, the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who had instilled in her an unshakable work ethic and a belief that every victim deserved justice, regardless of how much time had passed. She had grown up hearing stories of her grandmother, who had disappeared during the Chinese Civil War and whose fate remained unknown, leaving a wound in her family that never quite healed. That personal connection to loss and uncertainty drove Jennifer in ways that her colleagues sometimes found difficult to understand. In March of 2003, Jennifer was assigned to review a batch of cold cases from the late 90s, part of a department initiative to apply new forensic techniques and digital analysis tools to older investigations. Emma Thompson's file landed on her desk on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, one of 12 cases she would be examining over the following months. Jennifer read through the initial reports, the witness statements, the notes from Detective Morrison, who had since retired to a fishing cabin in North Carolina. She listened to the voicemail that Sarah had provided, Emma's voice crackling through the old recording, each word heavy with fear and resignation. Jennifer spent 3 weeks familiarizing herself with every aspect of Emma's life and disappearance. She created a timeline, mapping out Emma's movements in the days leading up to June 18, 1997. She interviewed Sarah again, now a 34-year-old woman whose eyes still filled with tears when she spoke about her sister. She tracked down former neighbors, some of whom had moved away, but remembered the night Emma disappeared, remembered Marcus and his volatile nature. She visited the apartment building on Piedmont Avenue, which had since been renovated and converted to condos, walking the halls and trying to reconstruct what might have happened that evening. But what set Jennifer apart was her approach to evidence that others might have overlooked. She believed that every case, no matter how cold, contained hidden details that could crack it open if examined from the right angle. She began with Emma's phone records, which had been obtained during the original investigation, but only cursorily reviewed. The lead detective at the time had focused primarily on Emma's calls in the 24 hours before her disappearance, looking for obvious red flags or suspicious contacts. Jennifer expanded her scope, requesting complete records for the 6 months prior to Emma's disappearance. The phone company had archived the records, and it took 2 weeks to retrieve them. But when they arrived, Jennifer spread them across her desk and began the painstaking process of identifying every number Emma had called and every number that had called her. Most were easily explained. Sarah's number appeared frequently in the early months, then tapered off as Marcus's control tightened. There were calls to Emma's workplace, a dental office where she worked as a receptionist, calls to the grocery store, the pharmacy, the pizza delivery place they frequented. But as Jennifer worked through the records, she noticed a pattern. Starting in January of 1997, roughly 5 months before Emma's disappearance, a new number began appearing in the records. The calls were always outgoing from Emma's phone, never incoming. They occurred during weekday afternoons, typically between 1 and 3 p.m., times when Marcus would have been at work. The calls lasted anywhere from 2 to 15 minutes. The number appeared 23 times over those 5 months, with increasing frequency as June approached. The last call to this number had been made on June 17th, the day before Emma disappeared, at 2:17 in the afternoon, lasting 11 minutes. Jennifer ran the number through multiple databases. It came back as unlisted, registered to a prepaid mobile phone purchased at a convenience store in Decatur, just outside Atlanta, paid for in cash with no name attached. A dead end, or so it seemed. But Jennifer didn't believe in dead ends, only in evidence that hadn't yet revealed its secrets. She cross-referenced the number against other databases, looking for any connection, any appearance in other investigations or records. Nothing materialized. Then Jennifer tried a different approach. She obtained a warrant for cell tower records, hoping to triangulate the location of the phone when Emma had called it. The process was complicated by the age of the records and the limitations of cell tower technology in the late 90s. But after weeks of working with telecommunications experts and engineers, Jennifer managed to narrow down the probable location of the phone during several of Emma's calls. The phone had been in the vicinity of North Druid Hills, an area about 15 minutes from Emma's apartment during most of the calls. More specifically, the phone had pinged off towers near a cluster of apartment complexes and small businesses along Briar Cliff Road. Jennifer drove to the area on a Saturday morning in late April 2003. She walked the streets, studied the layout, tried to understand why Emma might have been calling someone whose phone regularly appeared in this neighborhood. She stopped at businesses, showing Emma's photograph, asking if anyone remembered her from 6 years earlier. Most people barely glanced at the photo before shaking their heads. Too much time had passed. Memories faded. People moved on. But at a small convenience store, on the corner of Briarcliff and La Vista, the owner, a Korean immigrant named Mr. Kim, who had run the store for 15 years, studied Emma's photograph for a long moment. He remembered her, he said, though not by name. She used to come in sometimes, usually during the afternoon, always nervous, always checking over her shoulder. She would buy a phone card occasionally, make calls from the payphone that used to be outside. Mr. Kim gestured to where the payphone had stood before the city removed it in 2001. Jennifer's pulse quickened. She showed Mr. Kim a photograph of Marcus that she had obtained from his construction company employee file. Mr. Kim's expression darkened. Yes, he remembered him too. The man had come into the store once looking for the woman, asking if Mr. Kim had seen her. There was something in the man's eyes, Mr. Kim said, that made him lie and say no, even though he had seen her just an hour before. Jennifer asked if Mr. Kim remembered when this had happened. He thought for a moment, then recalled it had been summer. Very hot, maybe June or July. The year he couldn't say for certain, but probably 97, because that was the summer his son graduated high school, and he remembered the incident happening around that same time. Jennifer thanked him, her mind racing. Emma had been coming to this area, to this specific neighborhood, calling someone from a prepaid phone, someone she didn't want Marcus to know about, someone she felt she could only contact during certain hours when she could escape his surveillance. Jennifer expanded her investigation into the North Druid Hills area. She pulled property records, looking for anyone who might have had a connection to Emma. She reviewed police reports from the area during that time period, searching for any incidents that might provide a clue. She interviewed residents of the apartment complexes near where the phone had been tracked, showing Emma's photo, asking if anyone remembered her. The responses were mostly negative, but Jennifer persisted. Then, in early May, Jennifer caught a break. She was reviewing the phone records again, this time focusing on the prepaid number itself, rather than just the calls Emma had made to it. She wondered if the phone had been used to call any other numbers, if there might be a pattern that could reveal the owner's identity. The records showed that the prepaid phone had indeed made outgoing calls to several numbers during the same time period. Most were brief calls to businesses, easily explainable. But one number appeared multiple times, a number registered to an apartment complex management office in North Druid Hills. Jennifer contacted the management office, now under new ownership but with some records dating back to the 90s. She explained she was investigating a missing persons case and needed information about residents who had lived at the complex in 1997. The current property manager was cooperative, pulling old tenant records from storage. Jennifer provided the time frame and asked if any residents matched a profile she had developed. Someone living alone, someone who might have offered help to a woman in distress, someone with no apparent connection to Emma Thompson or Marcus Reeves. The manager came back with 17 names, residents who had lived at the complex during the relevant period and had since moved out. Jennifer began the tedious process of tracking them down, conducting brief interviews, showing photographs, asking if anyone remembered Emma or had any connection to her case. Most of the leads went nowhere, dead ends and false starts that consumed days of work. But the 15th name on the list yielded something different. David Morrison, no relation to the retired Detective Morrison, had lived in apartment 212 from January 1996 through August 1997. According to the property manager's records, he had broken his lease early, moving out suddenly in August with 2 months remaining on his contract, forfeiting his deposit. The property manager at the time had noted in the file that Morrison seemed nervous and anxious when ending the lease, had paid the penalty in cash, and had left no forwarding address. Jennifer's instincts told her this was significant. Finding David Morrison proved challenging. He had covered his tracks well, using his middle name James when he moved to a new apartment in Nashville, Tennessee, in September 1997. He had changed jobs, switching from real estate sales to insurance adjustment, working for a series of small companies that didn't conduct thorough background checks. He had essentially started a new life, leaving behind everything from his time in Atlanta. But Jennifer was patient and methodical. She worked through tax records, employment databases, and cross-referenced the limited information she had. It took 3 weeks, but she finally located a James David Morrison working for an insurance company in Memphis, Tennessee. Jennifer made the drive to Memphis on a Friday in June 2003, almost exactly 6 years after Emma's disappearance. She located Morrison's apartment, a modest one-bedroom in a quiet complex on the east side of the city. She knocked on the door on Saturday morning, her badge ready, her mind prepared for any number of responses. The man who answered was 42 years old, average height, thinning brown hair, with the kind of forgettable face that blended into crowds. His eyes widened when he saw Jennifer's badge, and she watched the color drain from his face. They talked for 3 hours. David Morrison, or James Morrison, as he now called himself, had been living in terror for 6 years, convinced that Marcus Reeves would eventually find him and make good on the threats he had made. Morrison explained that he had met Emma by accident in January 1997 at a coffee shop in Decatur. She had been alone, looking exhausted and frightened, with a fresh bruise on her wrist that she kept trying to hide with her sleeve. They had struck up a conversation, and Morrison, who had once worked as a volunteer at a domestic violence hotline during college, recognized the signs of an abuse victim. Over the following months, Morrison had become Emma's lifeline, someone she could call when she needed to talk, someone who offered advice and support without judgment. He had given her the number to a prepaid phone he purchased specifically for their communications, knowing instinctively that her calls needed to be untraceable. He had researched resources for domestic violence victims, shared information about shelters and legal options, encouraged Emma to develop an escape plan. He had even offered her money to help her start over, though she had refused, saying she couldn't accept it, that she had to do this on her own. Morrison's voice shook as he told Jennifer about June 17, 1997. Emma had called him that afternoon, more frightened than he had ever heard her. Marcus had found some of the money she had been hiding, had confronted her about it the night before. She had managed to convince him it was for a surprise birthday gift for him, but she knew he didn't fully believe her. She was planning to leave the next day, she told Morrison, taking a bus to Charleston, and then figuring things out from there. Morrison had tried to convince her to go to a shelter immediately, to not wait even one more day. But Emma insisted she needed to leave on her own terms, needed to execute the plan she had been forming for months. That was the last time Morrison spoke to Emma. He waited for her to call the next day, to let him know she had made it safely to Charleston. The call never came. He tried the number for Emma's apartment repeatedly over the following days, but no one answered. He was afraid to go to her apartment himself, afraid of encountering Marcus, afraid of making things worse. Then, about 3 weeks after Emma's disappearance, Morrison received a visitor at his apartment. Marcus Reeves showed up at his door late one night. Morrison didn't know how Marcus had found him, but the man had somehow traced the phone records, had tracked down the prepaid phone to Morrison's name through means Morrison could only guess at. Marcus was calm when he spoke, which made it even more terrifying. He told Morrison that Emma had left him, that she had run away, and it was Morrison's fault for putting ideas in her head. He said that if Morrison ever spoke to anyone about Emma, if he went to the police or contacted her family, Marcus would come back and finish what he had started. The implication was clear. Marcus had done something to Emma, something permanent, and Morrison's silence was the price of his own survival. Morrison had fled Atlanta within 2 weeks, changed his name, and tried to build a new life while living with the guilt and fear that consumed him. He hadn't contacted the police because he believed Marcus's threats, believed that the man who could make his girlfriend disappear could certainly track down and harm anyone who challenged him. For 6 years, Morrison had carried the weight of his silence, had nightmares about Emma's voice on the phone that last day, asking for help. He had been too frightened to provide. Jennifer listened to Morrison's story with a mix of sympathy and frustration. She understood the fear, understood how someone could be paralyzed by threats and trauma. But she also knew that Morrison's silence had allowed Marcus to evade justice for 6 years, had prolonged Sarah's agony and uncertainty. Still, Morrison was now willing to provide a full statement, willing to testify if necessary. He gave Jennifer every detail he could remember about his conversations with Emma, about Marcus's visit, about the timeline of events. Most importantly, he confirmed that Marcus had essentially confessed to harming Emma, had implied through his threats that Emma was dead, and that Morrison should be afraid of meeting the same fate. Armed with this new information, Jennifer returned to Atlanta and began building a case against Marcus Reeves. But first, she had to find him. Marcus had been missing for as long as Emma, had vanished into whatever hole he had crawled into after that night, in June 1997. Jennifer approached the search systematically, starting with the aliases Marcus had used on credit cards. She worked with federal databases, looking for Social Security number hits, employment records, anything that might reveal where he had gone. The breakthrough came in July 2003, when Jennifer discovered that Marcus had been living under the name Michael Reed in Jacksonville, Florida, since September 1997. He had obtained a false Social Security card through channels Jennifer couldn't immediately trace, had been working construction jobs under this assumed identity, had even married a woman named Rebecca in 2001. Jennifer contacted Jacksonville police, coordinated with local detectives, and began building an arrest strategy. On July 23, 2003, Marcus Reeves was arrested at his construction job site in Jacksonville. He was taken into custody without incident, claiming confusion and insisting his name was Michael Reed, that there had been some mistake. He was extradited to Georgia within a week, charged with kidnapping and murder in connection with Emma Thompson's disappearance, though no body had been found. The case would hinge on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and the pattern of behavior that painted Marcus as a violent, controlling man who had killed before his victim could escape. The trial took place in March 2004, almost 7 years after Emma's disappearance. Sarah sat in the courtroom every day, her hands clenched in her lap, watching the man who had destroyed her sister's life and stolen her away. The prosecution built their case methodically. They presented evidence of Marcus's history of domestic violence, of his controlling behavior, of Emma's fear documented in her conversations with David Morrison. They played the voicemail Emma had left for Sarah, her voice filling the courtroom with its desperate finality. "If you're hearing this, I couldn't fight anymore." The words echoed off the walls, and several jurors wiped away tears. Morrison testified, recounting his friendship with Emma, his attempts to help her escape, and Marcus's threatening visit to his apartment. Neighbors testified about the arguments they had heard, about Marcus's temper, about the sounds of something heavy being dragged across Emma's apartment floor that night. Mrs. Patterson from across the hall, now in her 80s, testified about seeing Marcus leave around 10:15 with what appeared to be a large rolled rug in the back of his truck, though she couldn't swear to what was inside it. Forensic experts testified about the drag marks found on Emma's apartment floor, about the area rug that had been replaced askew, about the statistical probability that a woman in Emma's circumstances who disappeared under these conditions was still alive. The defense argued that there was no body, no physical evidence of murder, that Emma could have simply run away and changed her identity as Marcus himself had done. They painted Emma as an unstable woman who had staged her own disappearance, who had manipulated Morrison into believing she was in danger. But the jury didn't buy it. After 3 days of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty on charges of second-degree murder and kidnapping. The judge sentenced Marcus Reeves to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Marcus showed no emotion as the verdict was read, staring straight ahead as if none of this concerned him. He was led away in handcuffs, back to the life behind bars that would be his existence until death. Sarah stood outside the courthouse that day, speaking to the small gathering of reporters who had covered the trial. She held a photograph of Emma, the same one that had appeared on missing person posters for 7 years. She spoke about her sister's kindness, her artistic talent, her love of music and poetry, all the things that Marcus had tried to destroy and ultimately had stolen from the world. She spoke about the importance of recognizing domestic violence, of reaching out to victims, of understanding that leaving an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time for a victim. She thanked Detective Jennifer Chen, who stood beside her, for refusing to let Emma's case remain cold, for seeing details that others had missed, for bringing a measure of justice even in the absence of closure. Because that was the hardest part, Sarah explained to the reporters. Emma's body had never been found. Marcus refused to say what he had done with her remains, maintaining his innocence even after conviction. Without Emma's body, Sarah couldn't properly lay her sister to rest, couldn't visit a grave, couldn't have a place to mourn. Emma existed in a terrible limbo, known to be dead, but denied even the dignity of a proper burial. Jennifer continued to search for Emma's remains, even after Marcus's conviction. She reviewed his movements in the days following Emma's disappearance, studied maps of the areas between Atlanta and the Jacksonville airport, looking for locations where he might have disposed of a body. She coordinated searches of construction sites where Marcus had worked, of remote areas where disturbed earth might indicate a burial site. She brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, every tool available to modern forensic investigation. But Georgia is a large state with vast stretches of forests, lakes, and rural areas where a body could remain hidden for decades. Emma's physical remains eluded every search. In 2006, 3 years after Marcus's arrest, and 2 years after his conviction, Jennifer was promoted to lead detective in the cold case unit. She had solved 5 additional cases since Emma's, bringing closure to families who had waited years for answers. But Emma's case remained on her desk, a reminder that even solved cases could leave wounds that never fully healed. Jennifer stayed in contact with Sarah, calling every few months with updates even when there was no real news, maintaining a connection that had evolved from professional to personal over the years. Sarah created a memorial website for Emma in 2007, 10 years after her disappearance. The site featured photographs of Emma throughout her life, essays about domestic violence and its warning signs, resources for victims and their families. It included the voicemail, that haunting final message, which Sarah had decided to make public in hopes that it might help other women recognize their own situations and seek help before it was too late. The website received thousands of visitors, and Sarah heard from women all over the country who had found the courage to leave abusive relationships after hearing Emma's story. Marcus Reeves died in prison in 2015, 18 years after Emma's disappearance, following a heart attack at the age of 56. He never confessed to Emma's murder, never revealed what he had done with her body, took his secrets to his grave. When Sarah heard the news, she experienced a complex mix of emotions: relief that he was gone, that he could never hurt anyone else; anger that he had escaped the full accounting of his crimes, that he had denied Emma even the basic dignity of a known final resting place; and a profound sadness that settled over her like a heavy blanket, the realization that this chapter of her life had truly closed with so many questions forever unanswered. Jennifer Chen retired from the Atlanta Police Department in 2019 after 23 years of service. She had solved 38 cold cases during her time in the unit, bringing closure to 38 families who had lived with uncertainty and grief. But Emma Thompson's case remained special to her, the one that had defined her career and shaped her approach to every investigation that followed. At her retirement party, Sarah Thompson attended, embracing Jennifer with tears in both their eyes, 2 women forever connected by a tragedy that had touched both their lives so deeply. The apartment building on Piedmont Avenue where Emma lived her final days was demolished in 2020 to make way for a new luxury development. Sarah attended the demolition, standing across the street as the wrecking ball swung through walls that had witnessed her sister's suffering. She found a strange comfort in watching the building come down, as if erasing the physical space might somehow ease the pain of what had happened there. The developer later agreed to place a small memorial plaque on the property, dedicating the site to victims of domestic violence, with Emma's name inscribed at the top. In 2021, Georgia passed new legislation strengthening protections for domestic violence victims and increasing penalties for abusers. The bill, known as Emma's Law, required mandatory GPS monitoring of convicted domestic abusers, expanded the definition of stalking to include electronic surveillance, and provided additional funding for domestic violence shelters and support services. Sarah had lobbied for the legislation for 5 years, testifying before state committees, sharing Emma's story, and making her sister's death mean something beyond the tragedy of a life cut short. When the governor signed the bill into law, Sarah stood beside him, holding that same photograph of Emma she had carried for more than 2 decades. The case of Emma Thompson, in all its heartbreak and hard-won justice, became a teaching case at police academies across the country. Jennifer Chen was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about the importance of revisiting cold cases, of looking beyond the obvious, of following evidence no matter how faint or how old. She spoke about phone records that revealed hidden connections, about witnesses like David Morrison who lived in fear, about the persistence required to bring justice to victims who could no longer speak for themselves. And she always spoke about Emma, keeping her memory alive, ensuring that her name was not forgotten among the statistics of domestic violence victims. Sarah never remarried after her husband passed away in 2012, never felt the desire to build that kind of relationship again. She devoted her life to her daughter, now grown with children of her own, and to the foundation she established in Emma's name. The Emma Thompson Foundation provided grants to domestic violence organizations, funded emergency housing for women fleeing abusive relationships, and supported legislative efforts to strengthen victim protections. Sarah traveled the country giving speeches, sharing Emma's story, educating communities about the warning signs of abuse and the resources available to victims. She carried with her always that photograph of her sister, smiling and full of life, frozen in a moment before Marcus Reeves entered her world and changed everything. On June 18, 2022, 25 years to the day after Emma's disappearance, Sarah returned to Atlanta for a memorial service. More than 200 people attended, filling a small church in downtown Atlanta. They were survivors of domestic violence who had been inspired by Emma's story, advocates who worked in the field, police officers who had contributed to the investigation, and community members who believed that Emma's life mattered, that her death had not been in vain. Sarah stood at the podium and spoke about her sister, not as a victim, but as a whole person, complex and flawed and beautiful. She spoke about Emma's love of thunderstorms, how she would stand on the balcony of their childhood home, watching lightning crack across the sky. She spoke about Emma's talent for painting, the watercolors she created that captured light in ways that seemed almost magical. She spoke about Emma's kindness to stray animals, how she once spent 3 hours coaxing a frightened kitten out from under a car and then found it a home. She spoke about the sister she had loved and lost, whose voice lived on in that final message, whose legacy extended far beyond the tragedy of her death. Detective Jennifer Chen, now 71 years old and long retired, sat in the front row of the church, listening to Sarah speak. She thought about the young woman in the case file she had picked up that rainy afternoon 19 years earlier, how Emma had become more than a victim to her, had become a presence in her life that shaped her understanding of justice and persistence, and the duty owed to those who could no longer fight for themselves. She thought about the phone records that had cracked the case open, about the patient work of tracing connections, about the moment when all the pieces had finally fallen into place. She thought about Marcus Reeves rotting in his prison cell before his heart gave out, taking his secrets with him. And she thought about the imperfect justice they had achieved, a conviction without a body, closure without complete answers, victory shadowed by all they had failed to prevent. After the service, Sarah and Jennifer stood together in the church parking lot as the Atlanta summer sun beat down with the same intensity it had 25 years earlier. They talked about Emma, about the case, about the changes that had occurred in domestic violence, awareness and response over the past quarter century. They acknowledged that while progress had been made, too many women still lived in fear, still suffered in silence, still disappeared without trace or justice. Emma's case had become a symbol, but it was just one story among thousands, one voice among a chorus of victims who needed to be heard. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, the latest model bearing little resemblance to the answering machine that had captured Emma's last message. But the digital file remained, copied and transferred through generations of technology. Emma's voice preserved in ones and zeros, eternal and unchanging. Sarah had listened to it thousands of times over the years, knew every inflection, every pause, every tremor of fear and resignation. She played it one more time, there in the parking lot, Emma's voice emerging from the tiny speaker, carrying across the 25 years that separated that desperate moment from this Memorial Day. If you're hearing this, I couldn't fight anymore. The words hung in the hot Georgia air, a ghost speaking across time. Jennifer wiped tears from her eyes. Sarah stood straight and strong, having learned to carry this weight, having transformed her grief into purpose. They stood together in silence for a long moment. Two women who had never known Emma in life, but who had devoted years to understanding her death, to ensuring she was not forgotten, to making meaning from tragedy. Emma Thompson's body was never found. The question of what exactly happened in that apartment on June 18, 1997, remained partially shrouded in mystery. But the essential truth emerged through investigation and trial. Emma had tried to escape, Marcus had prevented it, and a life full of potential had been extinguished by a man who saw her not as a person, but as property. The specifics of her death, the location of her remains, the final moments of her life, these secrets died with Marcus Reeves. But Emma's voice survived in that voicemail, in Sarah's advocacy, in the law that bore her name, in the foundation that helped others escape the fate she could not avoid. The sun climbed higher in the Atlanta sky as Sarah and Jennifer embraced one final time before parting ways. They would see each other again, they always did, brought together by their connection to Emma, but today they said their goodbyes, knowing that this 25th anniversary marked a kind of milestone, a quarter-century of carrying Emma's story forward. They had aged while Emma remained forever 27, frozen in photographs and memories, present in absence, her silence speaking louder than words ever could. The case was solved but never truly closed, justice achieved but never fully satisfied, a mystery resolved yet remaining forever incomplete. And in the end, that was the hardest lesson Emma Thompson's case taught everyone it touched, that some wounds never heal, some answers never come, and some silences echo forever, despite our desperate need to fill them with understanding. Emma had left a message, had used her last moments of freedom to tell her sister she loved her, to document her fear, to leave evidence of what was happening to her. That message had eventually broken the silence, had led to investigation and arrest and conviction. But it had come too late to save her, could only serve as testimony after the fact, a voice crying out from beyond whatever fate Marcus Reeves had imposed upon her. Sarah walked to her car, Emma's photograph safely tucked back in her purse. The memorial service concluded. The crowd dispersed. She would return home to Savannah, to her daughter and grandchildren, to the foundation work that filled her days. She would continue speaking Emma's name, telling her story, fighting to prevent other sisters from experiencing the loss that had defined her adult life. And she would carry always that voicemail, that last goodbye, those final words that contained within them all the pain and fear and thwarted hope of a woman who deserved so much better than the ending she received. If you're hearing this, I couldn't fight anymore. But others would continue the fight in Emma's name, would speak when she could no longer speak, would resist the silence that had broken over her final moments. Emma Thompson's voice had been silenced, but her message endured, a testament and a warning, a tragedy and a call to action, echoing across the decades that followed that hot June evening when everything changed and nothing would ever be the same again.